Growth Pod is brought to you by Genero, a leading growth agency in the Nordics. We interview marketing experts, business leaders, and entrepreneurs to uncover the stories and strategies behind profitable growth.
Today I'm joined by Sanna Suvanto-Harsaae, who is currently serving as the chairwoman of the board at companies like Finnair, Posti Group, and Bokoncept. Sanna has previously been on the boards of a large number of Nordic companies, including Genero Group, Paulig, Clas Ohlson, SAS, and Harvia. Sanna, welcome to the show.
Thank you for the invitation.
So what I'm really excited to talk to you about is kind of getting the board level perspective on things like company building, corporate strategy, and all those things. But I'd love first some background. So what were you doing before you kind of transitioned into these board level roles, and what was the first board seat that you ever got?
Let me tell you a very hopefully short story about how I got my first board. I used to be a CMO chief marketing officer, and actually also strategy officer for a optical retail chain. And I had a boss, a CEO, who one morning just flew into my office and says, "If you're ever asked to have a board position, take it. It's great." And he just ran out of my room. It was typical to him. And I was like, what is this? And if he had not done that, I don't think that about half a year later, when I was contacted and asked if I were interested to have a board position, I would have taken it. Because at that time, I had 3 kids. So the youngest was 2 years, 4 years, 6 years old, and I had a more than full-time job. But this triggering factor of him made me to get interested. Why not? And then I said yes. And my first board position was at Duni, which is a Swedish tabletop producer, all kind of things for napkins, paper, high quality napkins. And it was owned by a private equity. And it was a company in big trouble. And I was interviewing for the board, and I was selected because of my knowledge of turnarounds and very wide knowledge of European commerce. So that was my first board.
And then since then, there's been many more. What was it like making that transition from an operational role to then being on the board and kind of taking, I guess, a more, big picture view of the company? Was that a big transition? Was there something you had to learn or rethink?
I think I was very, very lucky to enter to a private equity-owned company where the board position is more of an advisor. It's a much more active position. Versus being a very, this kind of corporate governance, old-fashioned as it was. This was more than 20 years ago. So in that sense, I was very lucky. If I had been first on a board that was a corporate governance, old-fashioned listed company, I think I would never have continued my board career. So in that sense, it was easier because what was asked from me is to bring my commercial knowledge and bring my all the knowledge I had of how do you turn around business to my board job. So in that sense, I was asked to be a kind of advisor. But still, it is a very, very different job to be on your daily job and able to do and affect and really make things happen versus when you are what I would sometimes call this kind of advisor role in the board. Which makes it much more difficult to really get your points through. So luckily, they were looking for what I could do and what I knew very well. And that's actually one of the key words whenever I choose a board is to ask, is what I know something that's useful for the company that I'm going in the board at.
I listed some of those companies that you've been serving currently or previously been serving on. It's a huge list, and I didn't even list all of them. And they're operating very, very different. You've got B2B, you've got consumer. It's a very wide range of companies. So what are the things then that you add and what are the criteria that you look for? Okay, this is a company where it would make sense for me to go on the board. What are the criteria that you use for selecting those kind of companies?
I think whenever I'm asked if I could be interested of joining a board, my first question is, what are you looking for? Because there has to be a match with my background knowledge, what I have done, what I know I'm good at, and versus what the company needs. And if that match isn't there, I'm not going to join the board. There is no need. They can find somebody else. Today, luckily, the board recruitment, specific on the level that I'm involved, where it's a private equities, bigger family-owned companies or listed companies, it is quite similar as you would be looking for a C-level executive, i.e. you make a brief and you are very clear what you need is what kind of capabilities you need. And then I just see, is it something that I can match? I think this is very, very important for me to be a good board person, that there is a match between this company's need, usually related to their strategic needs, and then what I can bring to the table.
That makes sense. You mentioned that one of the big differences between board role and operational role is how you affect change. On the operational role, you're hands-on doing the things. In board, you kind of have to maybe nudge, influence, inspire, motivate. Are there any kind of like soft skills or meta skills, overarching skills that you find are especially needed to become an effective either board member or chair of the board?
I think the first thing is that because it very often isn't specifically your first board position, isn't your full-time job, what you really have to do is you have to get into the company. I mean, you have to do a similar kind of in-schooling as you would be joining in the C-level on the company. Meaning, I usually say that within the first year, you need to spend about 2 weeks in effective time, either visiting the company or company's places, as which you're joining in. So that is just a prerequisite. And sometimes I see people say, "Whoa, but there's a board position. I'll join in. I'll have the 1 or 2 days, how would I say, introduction, and then I'll go in." And that doesn't work. You really have to spend extraordinary much time to be a really good board member. Another thing that is really, really very special is that you can't come to the board. I've seen very, very many CEOs who've used, specifically if you've been CEO very many years, you've used to tell people what to do. When you come to the board position, that's not the way it works. The key personal competence you have to have in the board positions is to ask the right questions. And it's the ask the questions, which is, of course, always the good thing also if you're in any kind of active operating role, but it's ask the right questions. And the combination of right questions and questions really comes to the fact that you learn how the company is working and what's the company's current challenges.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So is there any kind of typical questions that you like to ask? Let's say, you're joining a new company as on the board. What are the first things that you start kind of pulling at? Or is it like going through just the financial data, the P&L, or do you want to be talking to people who are working inside the company? Like, how do you go about this data gathering process to make sure that you get a good understanding of what's actually going on?
The first thing is if you do paper research, because that usually also should happen already before you accept the position, so you understand what the company is. So that very much is the financial data. And you were slightly earlier asking, why do I have so different boards? But if you look from P&L perspective, for example, retail or airline companies or post logistics companies have a very similar P&L, which means there are some very big fixed costs, and the bottom line is very, very thin. So that is already one of the things you would do very early on. It is clear. I always ask, where does the company's gross margin come? So what's that one? And is that growing? If there would be a one single most important number on any P&L is gross margin, and then we can talk about if it's gross margin level 1, 2, 3, or 4, preferably in all levels, is to understand if the gross margin on that company is in all these levels growing or not growing. Because the companies that gross margin is not growing is in the end forever in a cost saving thing. So that would be the first thing you do even before you enter the business as such. The second thing you do is much more about getting into people. I love to meet the people on the floor, whether it is in the Posti, it's the people who are bringing the post out or bringing the packages out, or if it's in an airline company, it's the people who are really doing the work. You need to really see the reality in order to get the perspective behind the numbers. Another thing that I spend an enormous amount of, or I put my most focus is, if you don't understand where the money comes from, and this I mean the whole the customer journey, NPS, whatever it is behind there, the profitability of products, if it's a products on that sense, I really go into the understanding the top line. Where does the top line come? You can't cost save a company to growth, but you can build a company to growth if you understand where the money is coming from.
I think that was really very practical. Like you said, focus on gross margin, making sure that that's growing. Generally speaking, do you think that there's a lack of focus, a lack of understanding of, for instance, just the importance of that single metric among companies? And, we're dabbling in all of these different metrics. And one of the things that you kind of bring as a value add is that you bring that focus. Like, okay, let's focus on this metric. Let's improve that. We can figure out the other things as we go.
I think that you're using my favorite word, which is the word focus, and that is exactly what is needed. And in today's world, you can get so much distracted. You can get distracted on the geopolitical things. You can get distracted on, what's happening in the competitive base, what's happening in this and that, and wherever. There's whole disruption discussion still going on. I think you really understand what's really important. And to any company, if they are not growing in the gross margin level, I usually come into companies which have some years behind them. So bigger companies versus very, very startups. And you really need to understand, is this company growing? For example, if I work with the companies that have brands or are delivering to grocery retail, I have to understand, are they growing with the winners? Are you winning with the winners? Very, very big kind of catchword. But, it's a big difference if you're growing with somebody who's losing market share on their own end. If this distribution channel is not growing, then you'll have a problem because your customers are not growing. Whereas if you are playing and winning with the customers that themselves are winning, you have a double whammy in the positive sense, whereas otherwise you get a double whammy in the negative sense. So I think understanding that one. And in general, if I would say this way, in the board level, there's too little focus on how the top line is created. There's too much focus on where the costs and the internal numbers are coming, and too little focus on where does the money really come from, who are the customers and consumers bringing the money, and how are we developing? Are we developing the right consumers and right customers?
If there's too little focus on those things, what are boards then typically focusing on that they shouldn't be? What are the conversations that happen in board meetings, and how would you like them to see them changed?
I think it's a question about balance. I think that if I say sometimes the boards have a tendency to look historic data, you very much focused on how did reporting go from last quarter or last month or whatever it is. And that's background. That's happened. That's old news. And as any business, also the board is struggling to have KPIs and how do you look forward? What are the KPIs you have to watch which are predicting the future best? Even these KPIs are likely to be, they are leading KPIs, but they are likely to be something that is historic. But they at least can give you an idea where we're moving on this one. So one thing is just to organize your board work in such a manner that you don't leave too much time for the historic numbers. Of course, you review the quarterly reports, you review what's happening historically, but you review that on the context of what are we going to learn about these numbers? And then you have to put most of your focus and most of your time and most of your effort and energy to the future. How do we develop this business? So one of the things I do when I run the boards is I always divide the agenda. It's a one-day agenda. I divide the agenda, which is called running the business, which is basically the historical data and historical numbers and historical focus, what it is. And then it's thinking is building the business, which is a forward-looking. Are we talking about right things? Are we talking about the strategic key elements that we need to have to grow and keep the company healthy? So, as a chair, I have a responsibility to ensure that we have a balance between, seeing how the company is performing at the moment versus building the future of the company. And that balance is, it is easy to spend time asking about questions. Why did this and that KPI look whatever way it did historically versus putting an action to how do we improve things so that things will look better in the future.
I think that makes a lot of sense because I definitely have personal experience from meetings where, they kind of derail into this, you're presented with all these metrics and then one metric change can derail the whole meeting and everyone's talking about this minuscule thing. So I guess you make it really clear that, okay, fine, we could spend hours and hours on these past historical variations, but we need to talk about the future.
Now, there as a chair, you have the major responsibility of saying if you realize that the discussion is derailing, as you put it, or you're going to an effect on small things, you have to say, this is very important, that's very great, but let's conclude. Either we ask the management to come with more information next time, or we conclude we need to figure out why this happened. Because the whole focus needs to be, asking why was the gross margin low last month is a useless question. The key question is to ask, okay, guys, what are we going to do to get the gross margin back where it should be? And that's the same. It's basing on the same data, but the one question is forward looking, and the other question is backwards looking. And the backwards looking, why was it low, will get everybody on defensive mode. Whereas the question, how do we ensure we improve the key KPIs, when they are failing or not failing, is putting the focus on the forward looking. And that for me is both asking good questions, but it also putting the questions on the future perspective.
As you said, that small change shifts the focus from defensiveness and blame, putting to collaborative problem solving. Is there, when you're thinking about running a board, is there typically, are you a kind of a management by numbers? You like to have, like, let's say 5 KPIs, we're tracking those every quarter, or how do you think about it? Does it vary from company to company?
I think it goes back to your question earlier about focus. The issue is that if you in a board level have, let's say, 20 KPIs you follow, by the time you go 3 levels down in the company, you have 128 KPIs, and that doesn't work that way. So you need to, in the perfect world, you have one KPI, which is like top of the pyramid, and you look at that, and then if that doesn't work, you look at the second level and second level and second level and second level. So you kind of have the pyramid of KPIs. And it's a very few companies you can find this one miracle KPI. But we've been there. I was involved in a very, very big international company. It was all the ways in global. And we ended up finding, and I'm not going to talk about now which it was, but it was a cross-marching related number, which was a simple traffic light versus a year ago. How are we improving the number versus a year ago? And that became the one traffic light on top of the pyramid. And then if that was green, then you didn't even have to go to the other KPIs. In most of the companies, you should try to limit yourself to, in the board level, on the KPIs. In optimal world, no more than 6. But it depends about the complexity of the business, what it is. In a perfect time, you have 3, 6, 9. If you start to have more than 10 KPIs in the board level, you're in trouble because you're just confusing the organization, because they then every level has to like double the amount of KPIs that they are following.
Yeah, the power of simplicity is so incredible. It goes back to what you're talking about with focus. I want to talk, you mentioned the importance of future improving KPIs. Obviously, then the question of strategy comes into play. I personally think strategy is kind of a bad word. It says everything and nothing at the same time. But how do you think about then setting the strategy? Is there any kind of frameworks that you have, any typical process that you go through to figure out what the company's strategy should be?
I think this, again, is a very dependent about the company, because, depending about the company's needs, the framework could be very different. I do have some rules. If the strategy, including the purpose and the values, takes more than 1 page, it's not a strategy. It's a ramble or a history or a story. It has to fit on 1 page. And then I tend to say, if you bring it to the lowest level in the organization and they can at least understand main part of the strategy by reading that 1 page, then you're there, and so simplicity, again, I'm a very, very fixed on the fact that it has to be that way. I think the other thing that I mentioned there, I do not believe on a company strategy without a purpose. I am very purpose focused. I have seen how amazingly quick you can, for example, do a turnarounds in company if the company gets a purpose that is relevant for all the employees and they can relate to, which tells you how are you playing. It's in the end, the purpose is, why the hell are we here? What's going to lack on this world if we don't have this company? And if you get that right, then the strategy falls under that one. And in the bottom, it's like a bit of like a burger. You have the value on the top and the purpose on the top and value in the bottom, and then the strategy is in the middle. And that sense, I always say the simpler the better. And sometimes if you bring really intellectual consultants in there who bring to your strategy, the people can't say I'm a blonde, and I just sometimes say, listen, guys, if I can't understand the strategy, I don't think nobody else can. And it's not saying that I'm so good, but I'm saying that it has to be so simple that the people in the organization have to, 3 minutes talk. figure out what's expected from the company, what's expected from them from the strategy. So I'm a big believer in strategy, but I'm a big believer on having a strategy that actually makes sense, is understandable, and makes a difference. What are we choosing by choosing this strategy? Sometimes you say, oh, we have to improve on everything, all these kind of wabbly things, which absolutely helps nothing. But you have to be choiceful of which strategies you choose to get to the purpose and the goals you want to get into.
One thing that I feel like I've seen among companies is the strategy becomes a wish list of like, this is what we want to achieve, but it's not necessarily a plan of how we're going to get there and how our competitors going to respond, because, obviously they want to grow too. So how do you make sure that the strategy does not get into this wishy-washy, high-flying, disconnected from reality kind of wish list, and it's more so about actually concrete actions or trade-offs that we're going to take to reach whatever goal we've set?
First of all, the strategy process is a very, very important to get it right. And I sometimes say that the best process is kind of like number 8. With number 8, I mean there's the top management is in the middle of the number 8, and then they do iterations with the board, and they do iterations with the organization below them, and then you do these 8 couple of times. And by that, you actually get everybody on board, and you also ensure everybody understands and has their input in the strategy. That's one way of putting it. I think that I think it's a very, very different, and I absolutely people who work with me go apeshit if I see a strategy 2030 strategy. If there is a year on the strategy, it's not a strategy, it's a to-do list or a business plan. You cannot have a year on a strategy. A strategy works until it works, and it might only work a couple of years if the company is changing radically, or it might work for 10 years. I know companies, I come from a big American branded companies, they've had more or less the same strategy or purpose for, 20, 30 years, and then they change some of the parts of it or they add on it. But it has to be something which is a continuous strategy. If it has a year, it's a business plan, and business plan and strategy are mixed very often. Not to mention, as you said, to-do list or wishful thinking. And strategy has to be a choice, as I said, and very often, if you then, I would say also about if you have more than 6 key strategies, you are you're not focusing, you're not choosing, you're not choiceful what's needed. And those 6 strategies, you have to be very key. And what did you choose? What is the thing you did not choose when you choose this strategy? Is number 1. And number 2 is very much, so what does that actually look like in the reality? Because it's the look like in the reality, the execution, that actually is something that makes you to win or lose versus your competition. It's not the one-pager perfect strategy that makes you win or lose. It's the execution of that strategy that makes you win or lose.
So speaking then of execution, because you've seen so many strategies being implemented at various various different companies, what are the common patterns in terms of the kind of implementation that fail or succeed? Is there something that from, like, you already know that, okay, Bert, this team is not going to be able to pull this off. There's something completely wrong in the setup, or how do you think about common patterns?
I think the first thing is, if it doesn't fit for the one page, sorry to repeat that one, but it's so important. It isn't simplistic. The second thing is, I had an old boss in the big Procter & Gamble world who said the best strategy is the one you can implement. So it doesn't mean it's the strategy which is the most perfect, but the most perfect strategy is actually the one you can implement and execute. And when I see when things are not working, it is about, do you have the famous elevator speech? Do you know what's the 30-second strategy speech you're going to give to this person who's, like in Finnish Posti, who's delivering the mail? Can you then explain them in 30 seconds what the company's key purpose and strategy are? If you can, it's going to work. If you can't, it's not going to work. So that's one of the things, is to keep it simple. The second thing is repeat. It's like strategy by nagging. And the issue with this is sometimes that by the time the management is sick and tired of strategy, the people in the organization have maybe heard it once, and you just have to keep repeat. And it sounds very boring, and they will get tired of them themselves, specifically as they most likely have worked it a year before it actually gets to reality. But changing strategy too often is per se a mistake. And if you think you have a strategy implementation which is 1 year, you failed. You have to have a strategy implementation plan which is at least 3 years. And if you don't think 3 years ahead, you're either going to try to push it too quickly to the organization, or you actually don't have a right strategy, because no strategy should be able to be done within a year. Of course, you can do some parts of the strategy within a year, but the whole strategy cannot be implemented within a year. So those things would be. And if I then hear, and also to understand what we are measuring to show if this strategy is starting to work. And those are these leading indicators. You might not even be able to measure the KPI in the end. That might not nudge first, but you might start to see the first indicators that what you are trying to do is getting through. That could be with your customer data, that could be with your employee data, and whatever it is. And you kind of have to put those together. So if you don't have a strategy which has a clear measures, both the final KPIs, but also the initial KPIs, then I can also see this is not gonna be working out. So there are these kind of things that are the common mistakes. Too complex, too short implementation, and you just don't repeat, and a lack of purpose. I honestly don't believe anymore that you can do any strategy implementation successfully if it's not very well fixed to a purpose.
How have you find any kind of tactics that have been particularly effective, or ways of communicating, presenting the strategy? And I'm thinking here, for instance, taking something that, on the board level, people are comfortable. Okay, I'll take you something as simple as the fact that, on a board level, everyone knows what EBITDA is, or management level, hopefully. And so they may have those financial KPIs in the strategy. They may have some other buzzwords. They may have some references to how the market is changing. But if you're trying to get this message across in, let's say, a company like, or organization like Posti, you have tons of people, many of them working part-time, coming in, joining the company and leaving, et cetera, et cetera. So is there anything you found as a way to package the strategy in a way that it actually is received throughout the organization? How do you think about that, going through that process?
I think there is several ways on that one. The number 8, I was thinking of, standing number 8. One of the great things the companies I've seen who've done a good new strategy is that before they launch it, they do kind of a pre-launch wherein they sent to an organization, maybe not to the whole organization, but to maturity of organization, saying these are some strategies we're thinking. What do you read on these? Because it's very much sometimes just the wording. You just read different things in the wording. So if you send these out in today's world, well, luckily it's a very simple to do these surveys. So you do these internal surveys and saying, okay, if we can say it's about, let's take a terrible buzzword, customer centricity. So what do you read about customer centricity? It's just, how does it translate to you? Is this the customer centricity at all the right name, or should we do something else? So using these kind of feedback tools, which are so easy today to do, and for some reason we do that with customers, or consumers, we just don't do it internally. So that's already before. So you kind of do this kind of pre-selling by asking questions, clarifying, and getting them to get feedback to you. And when you do this, they actually become part of the whole project. So they have to be feeling that they've been heard and they've been part of the project, usually in a bit of a later phase, because there's no way the floor will know what the company needs in 5-10 years. But they can be part of ensuring that the way you word that strategy is actually kind of clear to them. So that's one thing. The second thing is using the same tactic. For example, if you do have a quarterly meetings and you always, talk about the results, and you should then repeat one part of the strategy, and you ensure you get a feedback, and you ensure that feedback, you can see, whoa, that's not what we meant to say. That's what we wanted to say, and this is what they are hearing. We need to go back, and so you choose to follow your own communication internally and say, did what I thought I was telling? Was that what was heard? And if not, restart, repeat. And any strategy, there will be, I don't have the statistics, but I would dare, if you're really, really good, you get 70% of the strategy communicated in such a way that people under you will hear it the same way you meant it. And then you are excellent. Most of the cases, I think 40% is maximum you get right first time, and rest gets wrong one or the other way. And that's just because people who might be in their 20 years, they hear a word blue and they hear something completely different that you meant. And it's a very human thing on this communication part. So ensure you measure if your communication is heard as you want it to be heard. And when it's not, and prepare it will not be, then restate, go back, rework until they hear what you want them to hear. And they also can play it back, not exactly the same words, but that whatever the intention was is played back on their own words. Does that make sense to you, what I'm trying to tell in that one?
Yeah, I guess then the way I'm hearing it is that, to play back, as you mentioned, is that there's no single format, there's no single silver bullet. It's constant communication, checking in, and kind of going through, pushing the message down to all parts of the organization, and there's no easy way to do it.
No, there is no silver bullet. There is no silver bullet. It is simply repeat, restate, simple, and keep doing that for a good while.
You've talked about purpose and said that it's impossible to have a good strategy now without purpose. So how do you go about creating a purpose that isn't this very wishful thinking, maybe something that sounds very good, maybe it's highlights some of the things that are being discussed in contemporary society, and how do you translate that into something that the employees throughout the organization actually can relate to? Oh yes, of course, I can see how what I'm doing in my everyday job, that contributes to this overall purpose. I feel good about that purpose. It motivates me. It creates alignment. How do you go about creating that kind of purpose in a company?
I think a good purpose is first of all, it's not this wishy-washy, for the betters of the life of the people in the earth, for God's sake. That is not what's purpose is. That is a rubbish. The purpose needs to be, the key way of saying is to start. What would the world miss if this company wouldn't be around? What would be missing from the society? And, it's a very few companies who can say, whoa, it's, the earth will go under, or the people in the earth will feel terrible if we are not around. Usually it's much more concrete, and we need to be concrete, and we need to be truthful for what we are. So in that sense, I said it has to be related to the company and what the company is doing. So that's one part of it. So be down to earth versus wishy-washy, too high-flying rubbish. Perfectly honestly. The second thing that I think is it needs to be something that you are not yet doing. So there needs to be an aspiration. It needs to be something which is a stretch. Let me give you an example. When I was chairing Altia, and that's the Anora nowadays, the branded spirit manufacturer, the Nordic's biggest that one. When I entered there, we were into, this is 10 years ago, it was the brink of a turnaround, and we had to really do things. And it was a multi-Scandinavian organization. Here's where the Swedes come very good on hand. They cannot work, in my opinion, if they don't have a purpose. Because if you try to get the Swedes to work on strategy, they will always, one way or the other, try to drive the question, but what are we really trying to do? And that's the purpose. So this was an alcohol company very much based on vodka and very much based on volumes and the monopolies on the company countries. And when I entered the board, the first discussion was usually how many liters Koskenkorva did we do last month, which was a ridiculous question to ask. But so it was very much of a volume game. It was about manufacturing enough things. And when they changed, and when we changed the purpose, and I can come back to you how we got in there, and it was by the management. The board was not involved on creating it. It was all about this simple, and it's a fantastic because not very often do you get this simple purpose. But Altia, as a branded alcohol company, ended up with the purpose: let's drink better. So that sounds very simple. Let's drink better, but there's a key word there. The word better. It's let's actually tells you we are drinking together, not that somebody drinks an enormous amount of alcohol than myself. Let's involve people. Drink says we are still an alcohol company. We can't hide away from it. Let's not do it. Let's drink better, not more, but better. And that, for example, immediately left in that the whole innovation process was about better, higher value, costs more, but still delivers the better drinking experience versus just a drinking experience. And that, I think, is one of the most perfect purposes I've seen, because of the fact that it so simply changed the way the company was working from volume to value to just drinking to social drinking, which also in the ESG world gives you the responsibility that you're trying to reach responsibly versus not just drinking. And that, for me, it's not often you get to this kind of perfect, nearly a slogan type of purposes, but it's such a good example to give what it is. And it was created literally in 6-8 weeks' time by the management team alone initially. And then it came to the 8, it went to the board. There's a lot of more, meat on how does that then translate to a lot of things. It's not just a slogan. There is a lot of, things under it. And then same way, the 8 went to the organization, the next level, and you got feedback and you changed something, and it was really working perfectly. And the same slogan now, even if we joined with our competitor and became a bigger company, they changed it very little because they realized that was the most powerful purpose there was for a Nordic branded alcohol company. So the purpose has to be down to earth, but it has to require something that the company is not yet delivering.
That's a fantastic benchmark, or case study rather. I'd love if we could quickly talk about, let's say, for instance, Finnair, a company that's close to the heart of all Finns, I would say. So can you quickly talk about, the strategy and purpose for them? The airline industry is notoriously difficult, I would say, very unprofitable, very risky. So how have you been thinking about that at Finnair?
I think, I've been chairing Finnair now for 6-7 months. I think that, to be perfectly honest, I'll take the discussion with you in a year's time, because Finnair very much giving the change that it has to face with the over Russia edge to traveling to Asia. The gateway to Asia, which was the old purpose, is definitely not livable as per se alone anymore. So Finnair has updated its strategy during the summer when things now are much more better. We still need to work on these pieces exactly on Finnair. So Finnair, let's talk in years' time. Posti, where I've been 3 years, which is the Finnish postal logistics company. I think there we are beyond that. And there we did exactly that within the first year that me and the new CEO came into the board. We went through the strategy process, the purpose process. And I think that there we are further down. So with Finnair's case, I think you need to come back to me on this one.
That's a perfect excuse to do a follow-up episode next year. So I'll take you up on that offer. Let's talk a little bit about some kind of culture, leadership style questions. I mentioned off air that you spoke at a Google Uncover event here in Helsinki in May. That's when I was there, and my key takeaway from your kind of keynote was, wow, this was very kind of clear, bold messaging that I think we need to hear in the corporate world. And it kind of stood out the impression that I got was there's definitely a need to make tough decisions, and as a leader you can't shy away from that. So I'd love to hear about kind of your general thoughts about, first of all, how do you build a culture of accountability, transparency, and kind of, let's say, call it high performance, and how do you think about your role as a board member or chair in affecting that kind of cultural change if it's needed?
It's a fantastic question. There's actually 2 things that I hear your question. One is how do we build a high performance focused organization? And the second thing is, if we need to change the culture of the company, how do you do that? Let me try to get to the high performance first. I think you asked me before without me really answering it, but I think I did answer without stating it. I'm a number believer. I'm very much believing in numbers. Numbers don't lie. Numbers are what they are. And any company that has been able to improve their results have been focusing on a very few KPIs, numbers that everybody in the organization, it might, go different, but it's still the same number. Just let's stay on our cross margin example. If that's the number, then depending about your area of responsibility, it's the cross margin on your business, whereas the top mentioned that one. So it's about finding the numbers. And why am I so number oriented? I think there is, in the most of the companies I'm chairing, there is absolutely no, initiative plans, bonus plans, initiative plans that has any wishy-washy, kind of what would you call face correlation or how do you do things? It's all about numbers. And numbers don't have to be financial numbers. They can be things done. Certain date is a number. They can be improvements. How well do you improve some things? Do you improve the brand awareness, the brand standing, the ENPS, so employee engagement numbers? There's a huge amount of numbers. But for me, it's a key. It's a number, because numbers don't lie. And then you can't wiggly-woggly out of yourself of those things. Of course, when things like Corona or whatever happens, that's a different story. But let's just assume about normal year when you don't have to do these changes. You basically know what you're measured, and you know that that's what your responsibility is to get to that number. That's what you will be measured on. And if the number doesn't come, too bad, so sad, my friend. Of course, you have you never have one number, it's hit or not hit. It's usually a scale that you have to, something starts somewhere and something ends there. And as you can hear, I'm also believing that the incentives team should be focused on these KPIs. And that, for me, brings a culture of accountability, a performance. It forces everybody to look where we try to get. And on that, yes, for me, also the right number is always an index versus year ago. It's not necessarily the absolute number only, but index versus year ago. Improvement number is key for me, the delta. So that's about the accountability and high performance and how do you ensure. And there the board can play a much bigger role, because you usually agree these numbers on the top level. And again, they should scale down as a pyramid for lower levels. When it comes to culture, I think the first thing you have to understand a culture, that it is a very, very difficult to figure out what really is the culture in the company. It usually has nothing to do with the values written on a piece of paper or put on the wall. If you're lucky, if you have good values, you only have 3 of them. And if you're really lucky, 2 of them are the real values. And then there is a third one always, which is more about what I call the painting in the wall, or just the way things are. And any company that's older than 3 years will have their own painting in the wall, and it's not always what you want to do. And the biggest difficulty there for the board is to figure out, so what is the real culture? And how do we find out what is the real culture? And there's 2 ways of getting there. None of them are perfect. One is to look for numbers again. Employee opinion surveys, sick leave on different places in the organization. I can tell you from retail, before we figure out that there is a bad store manager somewhere, we can see that the sickness rates goes up. Happens every time, by the way. And then there is, in the other hand, just going to the organization and asking questions. And actually, even better, asking the organization to ask you questions. One of the things that I do when I only can is to meet with the employee representatives, the union members. And I tell them, I have nothing to tell you, but I'm here to listen to you. And if they start to ask you a question, which you're thinking, wow, why are they asking me this question? There is usually a reason for that one. And you have to be very, very carefully listening, understanding. If that's what they are asking and you think they should not ask that, then there's something wishy-washy going on. And usually it goes back on the cultural way of working together. That would be my kind of, on the accountability, other hand, on the culture. And changing a culture takes at least 3 years. And again, it's a one by one way of doing it. But culture changes under 3 years are not possible. And even if you do it in 3 years, you're a masterpiece. I would say normally it takes about 5+ years.
Obviously, I think cultures, at least on the surface level, will look very different depending on the companies. Companies are so different. But is there anything kind of common denominators that you always focus on? Is it again like that focus on numbers and letting the numbers drive the business, and the incentives are the kind of common patterns that you always try to make sure are found in that culture?
I'm very much usually looking, and if there, first of all, I'm a big believer of employee opinion surveys, but the number I'm looking is engagement. It's not about ENPS, because that's about, do I recommend it for outside? And sometimes there are companies where people really like to work, but they don't want to tell it to outsiders that I'm working there, which is quite funny. But in that case, the engagement, am I engaged to my work, is the key number for me. And that the first thing of that engagement number is how many people responded to an employee opinion survey. And just recently, I was working with a much smaller company, and they were so proud. It was our first employee opinion survey, and we got a 68% response rate. I said, rubbish. I have a company with several thousand employees, with people located all over the world, and I get if I get a rate which is under 75, they have to just basically redo it, because the fact that people are not even engaged enough to fill the survey tells you a lot about engagement. So it's these kind of things you learn while being involved in so many companies, that you have to watch very much about the real top numbers on that sense. Then I think the most difficult thing is to measure is a trust. And trust is the key thing in there. And usually you cannot measure trust per se for a whole company, because it's sometimes really funny. You might see that you trust your closest management, but you don't trust the company or the top management. And in the end, it's the closest management that counts. However, if that's the case, then you also have an issue. So anything that can tell you about the trust, and you can't kind of ask, did you trust people, or do you trust your management? But there is a ways of working and seeing, do you believe your management is doing everything they should to ensure the happiness in the workplace, or things like these, and those kind of questions will tell you a lot about the management. Pure trust, no trust, doesn't work. Same way as I always say, if people don't answer to the question, am I paid enough, which word no, then there's too much stupid people in the organization. And thus you have to read these numbers sometimes with the perspective that you learn that they should always be. If everybody says, great, I'm well paid, then you're most likely paying too much.
Yeah, that's I completely agree. It's just so interesting, because a lot of the things that you are talking about are things that I would think are not very obvious or intuitive. So it really requires that experience. You have to have been in a number of organizations and seen the same thing and being like, oh, there's a pattern. I want to go back to the hard decisions, because I feel like that's something that's really important. I'll put two things out there for you. Number one was, I found one of your favorite political quotes. It's from Jean-Claude Juncker. Says, quote, "We all know what to do, but we don't know how to get reelected once we have done it." That's number one. The number second thing is a story I remember reading about Carl Icahn, the famous activist investor who goes on boards and shakes things up. He was on a board, I forget, some kind of company. The CEO came in the board meeting, presented this acquisition that he wanted to do. The other board members were kind of nodding off, and no one spoke up. Everyone was gonna vote it through. So Carl speaks up last. He says, "This is the worst deal I've ever seen. And if you board members, approve this deal, you're all going to get sued, because it's basically a breach of your fiduciary responsibility." So the board shuts it down. But had he not been there, the CEO would have made the acquisition of this terrible business that was unprofitable, and so on and so forth. How do you go about actually creating that kind of culture that takes those hard decisions? Is it a matter of incentives? Is it a matter of personality? If it's a matter of personality, how do you develop it? It's a broad question.
No. It's a very broad question. It's a very good question. It's a difficult question also, because in the end, I think the toughest discussions or the decisions are not about money. I tend to say, because if you see this if you take the second example you had about buying something, usually you very seldom a board would not to a purchase which is off strategy. What usually happens is you either are paying too much for the thing, which in that case comes a shitty thing because you paid too much for whatever you were buying, or you haven't been thinking about through the what happens afterwards. People get sometimes so excited of buying a company that they don't really think about then what on earth happens when we have bought it. How does the new company look like? And you have to think that before you end up buying the company, because that might be the biggest reason you don't buy the company. Is you just say, whoa, this will not work together. And 60% of the M&As, and this is another question of just learning by doing too many things, too many times these things, 60% of the M&As don't bring any value for the company. So reason he was most likely saying it because he had the knowledge that 60% cases is not. And then that helps, bringing that kind of data into the board helps the boards to say, is this going to be it's going to be the 60% or 40% case? And what does it need to be to make it a 40%, i.e. the successful case versus the unsuccessful case? So some of it's just purely, bringing up and saying, what do we do? On M&As, I'll come back to you on the other part. On M&As, actually, the best tool I have is a pre-mortem. And every time we do an investment in the companies I'm chairing, we have a post-mortem, which means 18 months after the investment have been done, we look whether it actually lived up to the discussion lived up to the initial investment proposal. And when you'll do them for a while, you'll learn that all the companies have a habit either being too enthusiastic or too pessimistic. And then you just learn that and you can bring it into your new things. But if you do a pre-mortem, that actually means, okay, guys, if we're going to buy this and we're going to do this acquisition, if we're going to do any big moves, what will it look like when we're on the other side and what can go wrong? And keeping that kind of discussion opens you to not do this, do we buy or not to buy? But it actually opens you to discussions which then might kind of come back to you and saying, whoa, we didn't think about that one. But if we buy that, the competition did that, whoa. And, sometimes it ends up you're not going to buy it. And sometimes it just ends up we're going to buy it differently or with different price or whatever it is. So this experience and bringing the different perspective and specifically this back to future and back, this future and back plan, how does it look like? What's the pre-mortem? How does the future look like? Is a very effective way of changing the discussion on that sense. But the biggest, as I said to you, the most difficult questions and decisions are about people. It's about changing people. It's about changing organization. It's about closing factories, because closing factories is not about closing the physical site. It's about changing a lot of lives of a lot of people. These are the most difficult discussions. And usually on these ones, a bit similar method works. But in the end, you have to, I think the key thing on those decisions is you have to put yourself a back end. And let me put it this way. Very often when I talk with the CEOs, they might see that somebody is not performing. And then they say, but this is not performing. And the first discussions you have is about how do we improve this person's performance or how do we improve that factory's performance. And after a while, the biggest mistake you make is you stay on this, can we improve the person or the factory or the unit discussion? Whereas you should yourself, you say, in people, usually I say, let's give ourselves maximum 9 months. And in 9 months, we have to decide if this person is in or out. And that discussion is something that, I've never been in a situation when somebody says, oh, we fired somebody too early. That has never happened. And that is actually the key thing, is to be timely and understand the bottlenecks. And these might be persons who've been perfect in the organization for the last 5 years. But while the organization grows, they simply don't have what it takes to take the next 5 years. And these discussions happen very often between the chair and the CEO. And the CEO is the loneliest place in the world as a position. And there, a chair that you can take this very difficult discussion is key. And then the same way of escalating through the organization, that everybody has somebody in the organization that they can take these difficult discussions, because this difficult discussion happens in every level. I don't know if I was answered your question, but that's what I get out of these two things.
No, you answered it perfectly. And I think that it feels to me that this is actually the most needed thing. It's not about, we talked a lot about strategy ultimately I feel like strategy is relatively easy, but it becomes impossible if you're not willing to have hard conversations or make hard decisions. Then strategy, I mean, it doesn't matter. You could have the best strategy in the world, but it's not going to be implemented.
It's a La La Land strategy, and La La Land strategy, you know, the fairy tale world, everything is possible and everybody can be improved. But in reality, I think one of the biggest mistakes people make is they try to be nice. And you should not be nice. You should be kind. And being a kind, for example, in the personal reviews is to ensure you're truthful to the person's performance, because nobody feels good staying too long in the position where they don't fulfill what they were supposed to do. Then it's better. It's kinder. It's a better to take the tough discussion and ensure that you both go to your ways. That's kind to the person you're doing. You're actually taking care of the person by being kind. By being nice, you very often avoid the tough discussion.
I love that. I completely agree. I could continue forever, but you know, we're running out of time. So, final question, a bit of a selfish one. Do you have any recommendations in terms of books or resources that you found especially effective when it comes to learning how to effectively manage all these different types of businesses?
I think you're now talking to a huge Oura fan here. So there is this book which is called Why Do We Sleep? I truly believe that sleep, it was actually also advice I was giving to one of my bosses. And let me maybe tell that story to the end. He said to me, I'm now going to give you when we stop working together. I said, no, I'm not going to give you an advice, and I know you're going to get angry to me when I give you that advice. And I was like, whoa, that's a way to introduce a last words. But he said, listen, sleep on it. And his point was, and he said to me very well, Sanna, you're very quick. You can do the analysis, but sometimes you need to sleep on it in order to find a way to do that analysis or explain that analysis to the rest of the organization in such a way that they can actually be with you. So his point was sleep on it. And he was so right. I first got annoyed. I'm saying, what do you think? Am I stupid? Do I have to sleep on things? But he was so right. Usually, very few things. There are things that require immediate action today. But those are urgent things. Something is in fire, somebody's life is in danger, or something really bad has happened. Most of the thing in the business world can wait until tomorrow morning. And on that one, Why Do We Sleep is one of the best books that I have read for several years. It talks about it talks about the importance of sleep, and it talks about why sleep is a very important, both solving problems, but also versus the huge mental problem we have at the moment with people not feeling very good. It's the mental sickness. It's not breaking the legs or backs, which is the problem now. It's breaking the head, which is a problem. So that would be one thing. The second thing that I would say, I'm not a big believer on all the business books, because sometimes or very often it's the same wine in a new bottle, or even worse, the same bottle, but it's really in that sense. I think that all the business people do very well of reading some non-fiction, preferably historical non-fiction. I also say that my favorite business book ever all time is Winnie the Pooh. Read the first page of Winnie the Pooh and you'll get an answer to a lot of questions and problems in the world.
That's a good takeaway. We've covered everything from corporate strategy to Winnie the Pooh. So it's been Sanna, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom so transparently. I will take you up on that offer to do a follow-up conversation, because I've got tons more questions. But yeah, thank you so much. And for people who want to follow you, is it the LinkedIn? Are you active on Twitter?
Both. We're more active in LinkedIn nowadays than Twitter, and Twitter more following nowadays. But LinkedIn is, I think, the best way of figuring out what's going on. And
occasionally, I know that there's interviews coming out, articles where you share some of your perspectives. So again, people can look out for that as well. But yes, I'll put those links in the show notes. Sanna, thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day. And yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening. You can find all episodes of The Growth Pod on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts.